SP21. Okay, welcome back. This is the second attempt at the ground lecture. I decided to do this over again without the embedded videos because I just found that the embedded videos, when I'm also doing a video of me doing the PowerPoint, just got way too complicated and seemed like a bit of a waste. Of course, almost all of the embedded videos that were in the original version of this lecture are also in the playlists of Back to Basics and in the playlist Living in the Past. So you certainly can, you see those videos and probably will see them because as you're going through the video playlists. So that's why I'm going over this lecture over again. Hopefully I'll do it relatively quickly. So when I was finishing the lecture on the process grids, there was one artist that I meant to including in the lecture and then forgot about, and that was myself. It occurred to me that probably my body of work in the last faculty show was probably the most memorable example, one that you saw in person of a grid work. And if you remember, there were two Sudoku boards, grids in the show, and they were relatively pretty big, made up of drawings. And so if you want more about those, there are videos just about those pieces that you could watch on my channel, not on the Process to Synthesis channel, but I'll go ahead and try and include them in a playlist as well. Okay, so ground, this is what this lecture is about. And what it's really about is the idea of where do you begin? As an artist, as a young artist, where do you begin your body of work? And so there are a couple of parts to this lecture, but the first thing I want you to think about is just that question of how you decide where you begin. And those of you who've had me for a studio class probably remember that on all the independent projects, there's this sheet that I give you that's called the suggestions. And the very first words in the essay for the suggestions is begin with yourself. And so I think that is often a really good place to begin. And that kind of sets the tone for the three themes that are in this lecture. The first theme is stand your ground, or stand in the place that you are, and basically just the idea of thinking about should you use where you're from, whether it's both, any kind of personal history or regional, where you're from regionally, all of that, should you use that as being part of where your artwork begins? By the way, I really like, in terms of thinking about looking at the ground, this piece by Andy Goldsworthy, where the way he makes these pieces is he's doing other work on a beach, like a pebble beach in England or Scotland, and then it immediately starts to rain because in England, downpours just happen like that, and he'll just lie down flat and be a human mask, and he will then create this reverse image on the beach. So the very first playlist or very first theme for this unit is stand in the place where you are. And I picked that song and that particular video for the reason of just really getting you to think about, I think this line right here, think about the place where you live, wonder why you haven't before. And that's really the main point I want to get you to think about, is that it's not that you have to necessarily make artwork about being Southern, or that you have to make artwork about any aspect of who you are as a person, but that you should think about it. Think about why does that inform your artwork, or why it doesn't inform your artwork. So now I'm going to talk about some examples of artists who kind of demonstrate that idea. We're going to start with William Eggleston. And for those of you who've taken photography, you probably know Eggleston pretty well. He was a Southern photographer based in Memphis. And one of the things that I find interesting about him, what I find relevant about his work for this lecture, is that he was not at all afraid to make his artwork about him observing his very particular world, his life. And that really was a major kind of like thing that made his work unique. Another example of artists who've had to deal with where they come from and where they are, I picked these two artists representing the post-war German artists, Anselm Kiefer and Gerhard Richter, they both dealt with the fact that immediately after the war, Germany had a lot that it had to deal with, and being a German artist meant that you had to in some way deal with them, and they both dealt with those things in very different ways. Um, okay, Takashi Murakami. Let me just talk very briefly about the Superflat School. Superflat is not about the painting being flat, although many of the artists who are in that group do paint quite flat, and Takashi Murakami himself very much appreciates that kind of aesthetic. But the Superflat School is about the idea of history itself and culture being flat. What he was saying was that growing up in Japan after the war, it was like all of human culture, all of Western art, all of Asian art and Japanese art, all of pop culture, Western pop culture and Japanese pop culture, all of it was really flattened and all in the now for him, and that's what living in the modern world is like. There is no history anymore. History is now part of our present. Um, and so some of the artists who have been associated with the Superflat School besides Takashi Murakami are people like Yoshitomo Nara and Chiho Awashima. Also, another good example of an artist where starting from a particular place that's very particular to her, Lisa Scavage. And there's a famous story that apparently in her graduate thesis when she was graduating graduate school at Yale, in her graduate thesis, that she spent some time writing about the kind of seminal experience of being a young girl and discovering her where her father stashed his Playboys, and how that kind of awoke her sexuality, but also awoke her sense of identity and of aesthetics. Another artist that I just added to this lecture is Rakib Shah, who is a British or an Indian artist, although I think he lives in London now, and just about just thinking about how his artwork is very much about um, thinking about his inherited culture. You can definitely see the influences of Persian miniatures on his work. Okay, so theme 2 is back to basics. So some people feel like, well, there's nothing that interesting about where I come from or, my background. But sometimes the thing that's interesting or meaningful or relevant for that person might be the media or the art field that they belong to. So here are some examples of artists who really kind of represent this idea of coming back to the basics, sometimes in surprising ways. Like an artist like Rachel Whiteread, you might not think of her artwork, and we will see a lot more of Rachel Whiteread as we go through the lectures. You might not think of her artwork as being very much back to basics in terms of sculpture, but if you think about the history of sculpture being about this balance between the positive and negative volumes, and especially the way British sculptors really thought about the emphasis of negative volumes, and especially someone like Henry Moore, you can then see how Rachel Whiteread, where she's literally making the negative volumes become positive things, right? Where she's making a cast of the entire interior space of a house, that really is part of this dialogue of what is tradition, what is basic in sculpture. I also included Michael Borman's, who I think his artwork probably makes a little bit more logical sense to you as to why it's about a return to what's fundamental, or someone like Reineke Dijkstra, where her approach to photography is very much about just this idea of like the connection between the camera and the sitter. All right, is what's fundamental to photography. So we are just about at 9 minutes. So I'll come back to you in the next set and we'll continue talking about the back to basic theme. Thank you.